Thanks for the warm welcome. I do have to say, it's simple. It's an incredible privilege and honor to be able to come to this place, this part of the world, and share my ideas with you. This is a brand new project for me. This is the first time that these ideas have been submitted to the public, so I'm excited about that. It's a big day for me. Although it's a new project, they are ideas that have been simmering around in my head since 2014 when this game that I'm going to talk about, Overwatch, was first announced. But still, thanks for having me, and thank you for sharing all of your ideas, because I, like I always try to do, I'm learning quite a lot in a very condensed amount of time. So, as a curator, I have two missions to a lot of my writing that I want to mention. There's the curator mission and the art historian mission. As a curator, I try to find experimental work in the discipline of video games to kind of advocate for, shine a light on games that are opening up new ideas in the discipline, renewing the discipline of video game production that way. And then as an art historian, I try to find theoretical frameworks that conventionally, as far as academia is concerned, don't belong on video games, and then I try to migrate them into video games and thereby also digital humanities. So I've tried, that's the kind of two cores of the sort of thing I like to do. I've done in other projects, and this one also operates under that logic. So let's jump right on in. The purpose of this paper is to question and evaluate the political efficacy of specific cultural, national, and racial identities embedded in global video game production. In particular, I'd like to compare Blizzard Entertainment's Overwatch and Studio Olio Mingus's Somewhere as globally distributed video game texts that politically signify in different directions when analyzed through Herman Gray's theories of limited representational politics, neoliberal subjection, transparency, and opacity. Additionally, they both express different political valences when discussed in terms of Alexander Galloway's concept of fidelities of context, a concept that I will be applying from a production side perspective. Hopefully this investigation into particular video games produces insights that are transferable to a wide analysis of digital humanities subjects, while also creating a bridge between the digital humanities and the theories of politics and race proposed by sociologist and cultural theorist Herman Gray. I'm going to be reading closely. So, to start, Overwatch. First of all, may I ask for a show of hands for anyone who's played this video game? Perfect. Overwatch was officially released in 2016 by Blizzard Entertainment, a video game production company headquartered in Irvine, California, in the United States. Overwatch is a team-based, first-person shooter available for Xbox One and PlayStation 4 consoles, as well as Windows PCs. It's colloquially referred to as a video game, but to refer to it as a game and not multiple games is a misrepresentation to those unfamiliar with the complexity of contemporary AAA video games, and AAA here being a designation of the top of the studio system, like saying a Hollywood film. Within the opening menu, and here's the opening menu of Overwatch, there are several different games referred to as modes, and they reuse the same characters and locations and play mechanics in different rule sets, and they frequently change over time. That's one other thing about contemporary games, is that the developer can keep on adding updates and changing the game entirely over time. So that is to say, the most standard form of gameplay, here's actually some more game modes. So there's just tons and tons of options. Even though you're sort of using the same core set of play styles, they keep on iterating them in different directions. The most standard form of gameplay assigns players to 2 teams of 5 each in one of 18 globally distributed locations. These are also known as maps, and the maps are selected by the program. Each player chooses among 27 characters to control, each with specific shooting, defending, and supporting abilities that complement or counter the abilities of the rest of the cast of characters. And these abilities are paired with various assignments of national, racial, class, gender, sexual, and sometimes religious identity that Blizzard has chosen to harmonize with the played expressions of these abilities. These character identities, represented through image and action, are interwoven into a series of narratives told through animated shorts, which they post on YouTube, and web comic books, set in a destabilized near future of our own world. That's the story space around the shooter game. So therefore, it's incomplete also to call Overwatch a series of games, but Overwatch is a very large system of transmedia storytelling. So there's also competitive play. There's another layer. Here's another picture of what it looks like to play the game. It's chaotic. It's like a lot of other first-person shooters. The amount of time it takes to get good at something like this is like learning a musical instrument. There's also competitive play and spectatorship at different levels of organization. And at the top of competitive play, we have this thing called the Overwatch Lead, which is a professional competitive esports commission run by Blizzard with 12 teams in 4 countries. Actually, between finishing up the talk and actually coming here today, Blizzard announced they were going to make 6 more teams in a bunch of other different countries, so this is expanding as we speak. Teams and individual players command the support of hundreds of thousands of international fans who watch their online broadcasts of competitive play, usually on a streaming service called Twitch, which is kind of like YouTube, except for streaming video games. And also a physical stadium has been constructed for the sole purpose of housing Overwatch as a spectator sport, and there are going to be more stadiums built in different cities in the future. So the physical space has begun to be constructed around this game. So it exists as the game, exists as webcomic, exists as animated shorts, exists as competitive play and stuff in stadiums and that sort of thing. So, although Overwatch is this complex system of media, the standard objective of the game at its core is simple, which I guess I should tell you how to play the game, right? Each team aims to control specific areas of a map for certain amounts of time, and players try to kill opposing players and keep teammates alive in order to control territory. And then to put it in other words, the team that controls geopolitical spaces through shooting and teamwork is the team that wins. So that is your overview to this large constellation of media production called Overwatch. To change gears for a second, this all-encompassing global scope of a media property like Overwatch is proportional to the scope defined in Herman Gray's influential essay, Subjected to Recognition, which is published in 2013 by American Quarterly. While he doesn't discuss games explicitly, Gray's essay focuses on the limits of representational politics across all media in the contemporary neoliberal political moment, and offers a valuable framework for considering the dynamics between Overwatch's producer, Blizzard Entertainment, and its globally distributed audiences. Drawing primarily from examples of African American media representation at different points in American history, but especially the civil rights struggle, but all over history, Gray advances a theory that runs counter to the prevailing attitudes of other cultural studies scholars, and increasingly the public at large. Gray questions the link between increased media representation of a marginalized identity group and the political advancement of that group. Instead, he suggests that the political efficacy of increased representation of marginalized groups is null and void, stating, quote, "Rather than struggle to re-articulate and restructure the social, economic, and cultural basis of a collective disadvantage, the cultural politics of diversity seeks recognition and visibility as an end in and of itself," end quote. This reevaluation of identity politics is nuanced, but centers around the logic that the increased representation of different minority groups in mainstream film, television, and other media normalizes those groups into a celebration of, quote, diversity, which replaces a discussion of, quote, race, and alienates identity from its own politics. Instead of collective progressive movements based on racial identity, such as the American Civil Rights era, representation of the 21st century is centered around the entrepreneurial subject, using assignments of race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, class, and religion as branding strategies. to advance the individual's position within a consumer-driven neoliberal system rather than to incite political change upon that system. Consumer-driven being pretty key here. So becoming a better consumer and entrepreneur with your markers of difference. Quote, this is from Gray, "The object of recognition is the self-crafting entrepreneurial subject whose racial difference is the source of brand value, celebrated and marketed as diversity. The subject whose very visibility and recognition at the level of representation affirms a freedom realized by applying a market calculus to social relations. This alliance of social, technological, and cultural fields constitutes a new racial regime, the shift from race to difference, and the recognition and visibility on which it depends as a form of power," end quote. It's important to note that Gray's theory is in fact the act of recognition itself, that the moment when hegemonic power sees a marginalized other clearly, that is what flattens out political agency. You see, it flattens you. Furthermore, it is not just the hegemon that imposes this normalization, but also the underrepresented group that endeavors to be normalized. In statements that many dedicated to the advancement of representation would find contentious, Gray actually calls out activists and academics for their responsibility in creating the conditions for the new political impotence of neoliberal diversity, saying things like, quote, "Post-structuralists, feminists, women of color feminists, queer theory, and cultural studies effectively reduce grand narrative's identity to small d difference." Gray articulates his theory in the landscape of popular media in general, but only gestures at the role that digital media play in this co-optation of political power through representation. He says it's happening in digital media, but doesn't actually use any objects of digital media as objects of analysis in his own essay. So Gray only focuses on writing about television and televised award shows. That's his main example. If you sort of endeavor to have like an award for being recognized on television or maybe in film, this is like the most normalizing thing that can happen to you in the group you represent. The award shows as his objects of analysis, and that's in the back half of his essay. Therefore, testing Gray's theory through an application to a ubiquitous new media text might have two significant consequences. First, it would potentially strengthen his theory by providing evidence that Gray omitted, and second, it could extend the critiques of the humanities issued in the essay to the digital humanities as well. So that's why I'm trying to put Overwatch next to these ideas. So when thinking about the efficacy of representation in Overwatch, the obvious place to begin an inquiry is with this set of playable characters, each with their own distinct identity assignments. And the reason this is important is that the category of game development that players and fans typically believe have the greatest political consequences is the design of the player character, the protagonist that players control and to some extent identify with. So representation in video game characters is notoriously poor, and here's some examples of that. Considering the enormously skewed proportion of white, cis-hetero male identified player characters in video game production since the industry's origins, Overwatch was met with a great deal of critical and audience acclaim from the moment Blizzard revealed the intentionally diverse set of player characters when the game was announced in 2014. Unlike the majority of AAA video game titles, half the cast of the playable characters are female. That's a precedent setting. Of the 27 playable characters, 6 are women of color, such as Sombra, the Mexican hacker, or Symmetra, the Indian architect. More on her later. 5 are men of color, such as Lucio, the Brazilian DJ, and you've got Doomfist, the Nigerian cyborg mercenary. 5 are white men, typified by McCree, the American cowboy, and Torbjorn, the Swedish engineer. And 6 are white women, including Widowmaker, the French assassin, and Mercy, the Swiss doctor. And besides these demographics, there are also some characters that do not fit traditional demography classifications, such as Bastion, who is a genderless robot, and Winston, a gorilla from the moon. While certainly not equitably representing the entire global population by any stretch, right? Overwatch is a visible example of a global production company making an intentional statement about inclusion and diversity in games, especially in comparison to other player character options in the field, like the big muscle guys I showed earlier. Blizzard Vice President of Human Relations, Jesse Meschuk, cited the diverse characters available in Overwatch as an emblem of their company philosophy, stating, "We really believe in inclusiveness. The power people feel when they belong to a community that's bigger than themselves. Overwatch is a good example of where we deliberately have tried to be inclusive of all different types of people." Meschuk specifically applied this concept as more than just the Overwatch cast as corporate symbol, stating that Blizzard's employees represent 38 countries, working at 9 separate international campuses. There's 2 in the United States, Irvine and Austin, and they have other campuses in Versailles, Seoul, Cork, Shanghai, Sydney, Taipei, and The Hague. Their games are localized into 14 languages, and they serve an audience of 40 million plus active monthly players worldwide across all of their titles. These are all their games. The O with the thing in the middle is Overwatch. So this mission of diversity has been acknowledged by the popular press. Oh, that's a little screen grab of their jobs page. So they made logos for each of their campuses to state how they're very, very globally positioned. Okay. So this mission of diversity has been acknowledged by the popular press. Online video game trade magazine Gama Sutra published an article titled "How Overwatch's Bleak Beginnings Turned into Positivity and Inclusiveness" in 2017. This is less than a year after the release of the game. The author Chris Graft tells the story of how, over the late 2000s and early 2010s, video game professionals from all over the world were developing a new game for Blizzard called Titan. In 2013, the game was canceled, and the majority of the large team were reassigned to different campuses across the globe to work on different games. So 40 remaining developers from the Titan project were challenged with coming up with a new game idea to replace the canceled one in 2 weeks. They've been working on it for at least 5 years, and they're like, it's done. A third of you make a new game in 2 weeks. And in that time, they came up with the concept for Overwatch. Graft is quick to point out that this disbanding and the relocation of so many international team members tightly mirrors this important part of the Overwatch backstory, where a daring group of international heroes, the characters I was showing you earlier, they were assembled to save the world, but then they are forced to disband because the global government in the game story no longer trusts them and forces them to hide in all corners of the globe. This unstable but determined labor climate of the Blizzard employees working on Titan sets the stage for Overwatch's near-future dystopia setting of global instability, yet it's portrayed through this really bright, adventurous, optimistic tone, which is a little different for dystopia narratives. So Overwatch game director Jeff Kaplan places inclusion at the center of this concept, saying, this is also from this article, quote, "What we cared about in a game was a game universe in a world where everyone felt welcome. What the goal was inclusivity and open-mindedness. Diversity is a beautiful end result when you embrace inclusivity and open-mindedness," end quote. So they're really, their public communications are very, holding a party line. This is the game of diversity. So there are other examples for a push for diversity playing out dynamically between Blizzard and its audiences. After characters were announced, but before the game's release, popular video game blog Kotaku published this story called "New Overwatch Character Shows Blizzard is Really Listening," which details the call and response of fan criticism and developer changes in anticipation of the game. Kotaku suggests that feminist critics, including noteworthy feminist video game vlogger Anita Sarkeesian, were unsatisfied with the female cast of Overwatch as they all conformed to the same body type that expressed unrealistic standards of female beauty. Blizzard responded by announcing a new character, Zarya, the Russian bodybuilder, one of the world's strongest women. It's like, we hear you. We made a bodybuilder. Blizzard released a statement claiming the new character was an expression of improved representation and diversity, saying, quote, "We've been hearing a lot of discussion among players about the need for diversity in video games. That means a lot of things. They want to see gender diversity. They want to see racial diversity. They want to see diversity along the lines of what country people are from." This goes on for a while. "We want everyone to come and play. Increasingly, people want to feel represented from all walks of life, everywhere in the world. Boys and girls, everybody. We feel indebted to do our best to honor that," end quote. As the title of the Kotaku article indicates, the press praised this new character as a progressive step in the right direction, and the author concluded, quote, "It's really cool to see more body types represented in games, you know?" End quote. To take another example, Blizzard precipitated a flurry of online conversation when it released a webcomic where the female British time traveler character, Tracer, was in a relationship with another woman. To fans, this amounted to Blizzard officially stating as a company that a main cast member was canonically lesbian, and I use this term canonically to distinguish that which the company has stated publicly is a part of the official Overwatch storyline, and the set of hundreds of other examples where fans have already gone ahead and decided that Overwatch characters are queer, just from the fans' perspective. Socially progressive fans praised this choice. Homophobic fans criticized Blizzard, and Blizzard took the position of a benevolent patron of increased diversity and representation. So in this list of interactions between fans and Blizzard, kind of just goes on and on. So simply put, Overwatch can be read as a self-portrait of Blizzard Entertainment, the global corporation who produces it, and could stand in as an illustration for the dynamics of other global corporations like it. Because of the many participatory points of entry afforded by the conventions of new media, as you can play a video game, you can go through the menus and check other people's scores, you can watch other people play video games, you can tweet at Blizzard, there's all these ways that you can participate, right? Because of these conventions of new media, to use to describe Overwatch, we can think of it not as simply a video game, but as a whole political system with a video game running at the engine of its core. The representational politics playing out in Overwatch match Herman Gray's description of representation within the neoliberal political moment. The diversity of the image economy of Overwatch characters doesn't deliver political progress per se. Instead, they normalize marginalized groups as better consumers of the media market that is controlled and managed by companies like Blizzard. This is how I think Gray's theory would apply to these dynamics. Although marginalized groups are afforded more opportunities to identify with the characters represented on screen, the design of these characters and the terms of their release their release and use are set by Blizzard, or people like Jeff Kaplan, the game director, or the rest of the Overwatch team. And they're headquartered in California, but they have aspirations of becoming an ever more powerful yet benevolent global corporate power. So individual gains can be made in a sort of individual, everyday context, but each marginalized group is alienated from its ability to deliver collective grievances because the structure remains the same. It's important to mention how counterproductive a critique like Gray's can feel to those who are actively involved with projects to increase representation in media, something that seems to be getting more and more traction in global media in the late 2010s, and who find that they are making significant victories in that project right now. So even within the politics constructed and governed by Blizzard, should we agree with Gray that there is nothing of value in diversity for a video game fan who has more ability to identify with one part of an enormous media system rather than being left out of it like so many other power structures? Or we could ask, is there no point in producing digital media that offers opportunities for marginalized groups to be represented by and thus access a center of cultural power, which I would describe Overwatch as? So I'm going to add a little more Herman Gray. So Gray's theory is what I might call a winless critique. It's the kind of critique where evidence is salient, but no real positive proposal is offered. There's really no way out of this dilemma. So we just sort of trapped in neoliberal politics, and there's no way out, which is kind of a bummer if you're concerned with producing media and doing things. In this case, it's much of the frustration of humanists invested in the importance of representation in media production. There is no way to win, there's no way to move forward in the hope of achieving greater equality. But in another lecture by Gray, titled Reading Peabody, delivered by Northwestern University in 2017, he may offer a way out of this representational cul-de-sac. And he was doing research in the Peabody television archives in Athens, Georgia, and Gray identifies two approaches to producing television: transparent programs and opaque programs. So analyzing locally produced television, dealing with the subject of race during the American Civil Rights era, Gray determines that transparent shows incorporate marginalized groups into media where they can be clearly seen and immediately understood in terms determined by the party in power. In his case, these are shows developed by white Americans interviewing African Americans on their thoughts about racial tension. However, on the other side, there's another category of opaque shows that are developed by and from the perspectives of marginalized parties through artistic and experimental techniques that do not submit to or correspond to the questions or structures put in place by the hegemon. In this case, opaque television was made by African Americans on their own terms, not playing into the ideologies and values of the white power structure, and therefore these programs were politically potent, but also inscrutable to white Americans. So for Gray, opaque television illustrates a key concept from the famous W.E.B. Du Bois book, The Souls of Black Folk, where Du Bois famously stated, to the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word, sort of saying, I'm just refusing to participate in the questions coming from the power structure. To try and open up the possibilities for cultural identity embedded in video game production, I would like to try to transpose these two categories of the transparent and the opaque in the same way I've tried to transpose the larger theory of subjection to recognition. And in order to do so, I'm going to bring in just one more theoretical tool from the field of video game scholarship, because I am a game scholar after all. So, in social realism, this is the cover of Galloway's book, Gaming. In social realism, from his highly influential book, Gaming: Essays on Algorithmic Culture, Alexander Galloway provided an invaluable clarification between what is considered realistic and realist in video games. Two terms that have been conflated for years before the publishing of his book, and they still continue to be conflated to this day. Galloway argues that when people talk about achievements in video game realism, they normally are referring to how realistic they are represented visually. So realisticness is simply a measure of that visual accuracy. However, while transposing theories of realism from Italian neo-realist film to video games, he also suggests other considerations need to be made because this is a participatory medium. He says that video games, for them to be truly realist, there must be this fidelity of context between the player and the game. That is to say, if a video game does not have a social commentary on human reality embedded in it, there's actually a second contingency of realism. The player of the game must also have an individual connection to the lived reality commented upon in the game, whether this be a shared racial, class, national, or cultural context. And a game would then cease to be and then again become realist depending on different audiences and different moments of play. So it is not then contingent on the game itself, but on the interaction between game and player. So while I have found this categorical distinction between realist and realistic invaluable for clearing up a lot of confusion in the language of game studies, I have always had difficulty with this dead-end requirement of the fidelity of context between player and game. Surely, some of the political reality described by a political video game could be communicated to a player of a different cultural context, even if they did not ascertain the full political context of that game. Otherwise, why are we trying to communicate with each other with media if it can't transfer from context to context? Yes, this attention to correspondence between game and lived experience is an insightful way to go about studying any video game because of the wide contingency of play style and player reception. So, to approach this dilemma in the context of Overwatch, I am interested in opening this dynamic concept to include more than a correspondence between player and game. And I'd like to ask, what of the correspondence between cultural experience of video game producer and the game he or she produces? Can we see a fidelity of the developer's context embedded into video game mechanics, character design, let's say art asset creation, tools engineering, level design, all these different departments of video game production, and the rest of the production process? Could searching for and attending to a fidelity of context on the production side, rather than the player side, offer some insight into the political possibilities embedded in identity representation in video games? In other words, could we look at an identity politics of video games where the political value of representation does not correspond between produced image and audience, but between playable mechanic and video game producer? So, back to Overwatch. Let me return to this character that Overwatch offered. Blizzard made this character to represent India. Symmetra. Symmetra's backstory is that she is originally from an impoverished community in Hyderabad, but is now employed as an architect for the high-powered Ishkar Corporation in a webcomic published about the character. Blizzard reveals that although Symmetra believes in the utopian values of improved lives for all, she is compromised by the dubious methods used by her employer to win contracts over the public sector. You know what those. In-game, she is, this is important, so in-game she is considered a support character rather than an attack or defense or tank character. And this is her playing. This is what it looks like if you were playing as Symmetra. She has a weak handheld weapon, which is not the most effective for direct combat. Instead, she builds little laser turrets that serve as remote traps for the enemy team, and has an ultimate ability. And these are like, you store up your energy while you're fighting, and you get your ultimate ability, and they're used to turn the game around, and they're usually big, dramatic moments, like you send 2 dragons out of you, or something like this. So Symmetra's ultimate ability is that she builds a teleporter that can allow teammates to instantly travel from their home base to the main site of combat, and that is her making her teleporter. In other words, her role is to build technology to aid other teammates. While she is portrayed as a powerful female character, embraced by many players, I'd like to suggest that Symmetra is an example of a transparent, drawing from Gray's categories, this is a transparent fidelity of context in terms of video game mechanics and character design. Powerful as she may be, her design is undergirded by American-centric perspectives, trying to engage Indian and female-identifying players, while trafficking in stereotypes of Indian people and women held by that aforementioned American-centric perspective. To put it bluntly, Symmetra is a highly skilled professional. She's not a soldier, she's not a lone gun or assassin. Blizzard has positioned Symmetra as the tech support character for the other fighters of the Overwatch cast. So visually speaking, her character design, also just this is a side note, like the visual design, it looks highly impractical for combat and has more to do with superhero aesthetics than it really has anything to do with like Indian sartorial traditions. She can be quickly identified as Indian by those who Blizzard is trying to enfranchise, but more importantly, this is a quickly and digestibly she's quickly and identifiably digestible as Indian to Blizzard and other identity groups that Blizzard is trying to court. So in other words, Symmetra, as a transparent approach to game production, is a template of Indian identity developed by a globalized American company offering to Indian identifying video game players worldwide. So India is represented, yet carved from an idea of recognition designed by this American-based hegemon. Second, and universe. Leave Overwatch for a second, or maybe for the rest. That's all the Overwatch. Okay, second, I would like to offer a contrast to Overwatch to illustrate the potential for cultural opacity in video game production. The two-person video game studio Oleo Mingus has been developing games since 2014, the same year that Blizzard announced Overwatch. Just a coincidence. They are based in Challa, India, and their games are globally distributed through their website and through video game sales platforms itch.io and Steam. Itch.io is a lot like Steam, except it's sort of for indie games and art games. While their audience is global, it is certainly a much smaller scale of production than the AAA game production company like Blizzard. Yet they also create games through a transmedia approach, so that's kind of similar to Overwatch. Since they began, they have been working on a single video game called Somewhere, yet Somewhere currently exists as a series of short narrative-driven video game vignettes. Two of these short games, one called The Museum of Dubious Splendors and the other called Timruck, share the aesthetic of tableaus constructed of objects and patterns that nod to many different moments in India's complex history, as well as themes of post-colonial Indian identity struggling to unify itself through assemblages of fantasy and fact. But each only offer discrete little standalone glimpses of the larger world of Somewhere. And you can play one of these games in like 10 to 15 minutes. They're just like little, nice little poems. So, for the Museum of Dubious Splendors, this is an excellent example of this approach to a first-person perspective art game that leads the user through an unstable series of galleries and museum placards that juxtapose myths of India, sometimes from a colonial perspective, with impressive still-life constructions of everyday objects, and that hold some special significance to the stories described in the text. So to offer an example that I really like from the game, the very first placard, so you're walking through these galleries, and you're getting these stories and looking at these objects. The very first one you come across says, it tells the story of Peter Gregory Cantor, who's a great British traveler that discovered an inscrutable device in India that he can only refer to as the apparatus. Cantor becomes obsessed and undone by this confrontation with the object that he cannot describe or understand. Oleo Mingus then tells the player, you may now view the apparatus right here in the Museum of Dubious Splendors. The sequence ends with this visual joke sort of revealing that the apparatus is simply an imposing tube of toothpaste with the graphic design. The moment reads like a very playful application of Gray's theory of opacity. Oleo Mingus has not just created a work that is difficult to decipher, but also incorporates a narrative of a colonizer being undone by their own obsession with knowing the other transparently, yet never even being able to do so. And that's right in the context of their own transmedia game universe. In a correspondence with their audience on their itch page, Oleo Mingus has mentioned that they are interested in the idea of appropriating ideas and aesthetics of British colonial narratives, such as Rudyard Kipling, but refashioning them in their own pastiche of metatextual gameplay in a way that counter-colonizes the historical colonizer. So Oleo Mingus' Somewhere vignettes are highly literate in Indian traditions from a contemporary global perspective in a way that refuses normalization from a global marketplace of imagery. They're not drawing on a template for how Indian culture ought to look in terms of diversity or representation, yet they are, in a sense, representing India still in a field of contemporary art games through an opaque fidelity of context. The producer's cultural identity corresponds to their decisions in game production, but they don't proffer that in a way that is immediately transparent to a power structure developed outside of India. I don't have to prove it to anyone. Or pass it by some sort of a large multinational. So, how about a conclusion? So, since Gray's objects of analysis are television programs, and writing about television, yet he claims to extend the political limits of representation in all manner of digital media, or any media for that matter, under neoliberalism, it's necessary to test the overall claim by applying it to a specific new media text, as well as to see if the scope is really as wide as Gray suggests. And additionally, it's important to find out how much grace theory can be applied to research in the digital humanities. In the case of Overwatch, the subjection of representation plays out in a manner fully compatible to Gray's theory of race exchanged for diversity and difference, in my opinion. However, in Gray's lecture on the Peabody archives, he suggests there are other methods of opaque media production and television that resist recognition and therefore neoliberal appropriation and subjection. So by looking at the fidelities of context between video game producer and the modes of play created by those producers, we may see some methods of political negotiation available to the producer of software that may seem similar to the producer of opaque television. Elio Mingus' Somewhere embeds visual motifs, story, and play that draws deeply from regional identification in a way that does not fit a system of globalization described by a company like Blizzard. While I would not argue that the producers of video games connecting specific fidelities of context from their own cultural experience of their work have found a way to escape neoliberal subjection altogether, they are just certain methods of opaque game production that can embed unrecognized and therefore unsubjected elements of cultural identity into the discipline. So while opaque, these game elements are present and clearly an expression of specific cultural identity and difference. These are novel elements of game production coming from an Indian perspective that can impact the global conversation or platform of game production rather than fitting a prescribed Indianness into the template of global subjects that neoliberalism requires. So therefore, it advances Indian identity in a manner that bears political efficacy and avoids the pitfalls of immediate recognition of difference. So from a media specificity perspective, it might be possible that these political acts of media production are easier to come by in game production than in television production. So it might even be better to move this set of ideas into video games. Simply because the conventions of this discipline are emergent and they're very unresolved. So presently in video games, we might be able, at an advantageous position where cultural identity can push against hegemonic platforms simply because the affordances of this new discipline are not yet claimed. Thank you.